Welcome again to another Curator's Chat. I'm Jason French, Curator of Collections here at the Behringer-Crawford Museum. It is just about Derby time, so today we wanted to talk a little bit about Latonia and the old Latonia track, and I thought, well, who best to talk about that than Dr. Jim Claypool? So we've invited Dr. Jim Claypool to come here with some of his personal artifacts. I thought we would talk a little bit about Latonia. Dr. Claypool, what have you brought today?
Well, I brought myself.
Well, excellent.
And some artifacts. And, of course, this is a special time of year. People mark their lives by the Kentucky Derby, obviously, and Old Latonia was an integral part of the history of the Kentucky Derby. And to illustrate that, when the old track was founded, it was founded in an area known as Milldale, which later became Latonia. It was named after some springs, the Latonia Springs down there. Ultimately, it was annexed by Covington, and that's still a portion, the Latonia portion. But there was an agricultural association formed in 1882, and they wanted to put a track here in northern Kentucky. We had a heritage of sports and sporting people and gambling and such as that, and they understood that fully. So in 1883, they had erected a track, laid it out, and were about to run their first race at Old Latonia. It's the difference being, of course, Old Latonia was the original track, then later there was a second track called Latonia, which morphed into Turfway Racecourse. And what happened there was in 1883, June 9th, 1883, about 8,000 people got to the track. They got there by all kinds of ways. They got there by cart, by horse, by foot, by rail, by trolley car, and many other conveniences. And so they were ready to watch the inaugural race at Old Latonia. And the first stakes race, the major race there, was named the Hindu race. Hindu had won the Kentucky Derby, and they named it after him. It would remain that way from 1883 until 1888, when Latonia was strong enough to make its own identity and rename that race the Latonia Derby. And Latonia would hit the ground running. And I'll talk a little about that in a few moments. So the initial race, June 9th, 1883, was a contest between the three finishers in the Kentucky Derby the previous month. And they came up here, shipped up to Latonia to contest with one another. And the great irony would be they would actually run exactly the way they ran down in Louisville. The winner was a horse called Leonidas. Here's a painting of Leonidas with his jockey, William Billy Donahue. And the second place horse was a horse called Drake Carter, and the third horse was called Lord Raglan. And they finished exactly the same way. What is really interesting about this horse, this Leonidas, the winner of the initial Hindu in the earlier Kentucky Derby, was that the jockey was 16 years old. And it was rumored that he had bet all his life savings, which couldn't have been very much, on the Kentucky Derby, on himself to win the Kentucky Derby, which was absolutely against the rules. And what you have to understand was the gentlemen that ran these courses in those days, they were very strict. They had their own rules, and you better abide by them. So they ruled him off the track. So he didn't actually ride Leonidas in the initial Hindu stakes. It was a man by the name of Isaac Murphy, the most famous jockey perhaps of in that entire era and maybe of all time, because he would be the jockey that won more races, more stakes races, any road stake races. So he didn't ride in the other races. He had a winning percentage of 60%.
Wow.
That would put you in any kind of Hall of Fame for sure.
Yeah.
He was black, of course, and most of the jockeys in that period of time were black. And the reason was that in Kentucky, rather than the African Americans working in the cotton fields or tobacco fields and such as that, so many of them were involved with the horse farms in central Kentucky, and they just morphed into jockeys or trainers. In fact, the first three Kentucky Derby trainers were African Americans.
Huh.
And many, many of the riders in that era would be African Americans. Isaac Murphy certainly being the most famous, but many of the others came up here and raced here. So, interestingly, the family of Billy Donahue, William Donahue, was from northern Kentucky. The mother's maiden name was Watson, and she later would own a beer garden right next to Old Latonia. And that was typical of the time, the beer gardens and such as that. The grandson of Billy Donahue lives in northern Kentucky still. He was actually a clerk and a teller out at Latonia Race Course, so the tradition continued in that sense. But I brought something I thought you might find interesting. After Billy Donahue was no longer able to ride, he had to find something else to do, and he became a trainer. And he went up to Windsor, Ontario, and in 1929 he was training for the Seagram's distillers, Seagram's stables, and they sent 2 horses down to Maryland to contest in the 1929 Preakness. And the people at that particular banquet that they held there were given presentation books, and this is one of those, probably the only one that still exists, because I no doubt they were tossed away, but this one is also signed by, as you see, William Donahue, who won the 1883 Kentucky Derby. So that's the kind of things that makes Old Latonia fascinating and interesting. And as I said, Old Latonia hit the ground running, and it became part of a circuit, a racing circuit here in Kentucky called the 3L Circuit, which was Latonia, Lexington, and Louisville, of course. And the top horses competed against one another. Latonia became a very favorite for 2-year-olds because the track was so fast that you could get a certain conditioning for your 2-year-olds at that time. And they prospered. They prospered greatly. And there were so many things that would take place. We don't have time to talk about all of them, but Old Latonia was the pioneer in several things. One thing that was a pioneer in was, at the time, the standard bet was $5. They felt that the common people couldn't afford $5, so Old Latonia reduced the standard bet to $2, 2 to win, 2 to place, 2 to show, $6 across the board. That became very, very popular. There was a lot of pressure on racing in the early 1900s. The reformers wanted to say that was something that we needed to get rid of, and they outlawed bookmakers, and they outlawed pool betting at these tracks, and so Latonia and Louisville came up with the pari-mutuel system, which of course pools all the monies, and they considered it a different form of gambling. So that took place in 1911. 1912, something else very fascinating happened. A horse by the name of Wishing Ring was in an ordinary race here at Old Latonia, and he went off at 941 to 1 and won. He won. He paid $1,885.50 to win. There were 4 people that held tickets on this horse and cashed them in. However, there was an interesting story. One of the top trainers and racemen of this era was E.R. Bradley. He was from northern Kentucky. And his wife had told him, anytime you go to the races, bet me $2 on every horse in every race. Well, that particular day, he didn't do it. And so he had to pay his wife $1,885.50, which she thought was great, and I'm sure he didn't think was nearly as great. We have so many things happening at Latonia because it hit the stride really in this period of time. In fact, Latonia would, between 1915 and 1928, lead the nation 9 times in the size of purses awarded. And one of the great horses of all time, a horse called Exterminator, broke his maiden in 1917 at the Old Latonia track. He would run 100 times in his career. He was called Old Bones, and he won 50 times out of these 100 times. So he's in the Hall of Fame, obviously. We saw so many things taking place. Old Latonia was in its heyday. But one of the things it had to contend with, of course, was the German population around here, and the war had broken out. And there was a lot of anti-German sentiment, so the track tried to do all it could to promote American-type things. They had parades, and they had picnic events, and they had planes flying over the track and such as that. And at this time, Latonia was drawing all the great horses. And one of the most famous of which was a horse that won the Kentucky Derby in 1923, a horse by the name of Zev, Z-E-V. He was owned by Harry Sinclair, as in Sinclair Oil. And he came down to Latonia thinking he'd pick up an easy purse. Well, it turned out there was another horse down there who hadn't done very well. Actually, he was up and down, up and down. His name of the horse was In Memoriam, and he was owned by Carl Wiedemann, as in the Wiedemann Brewing Company. And a local jockey, who was a Hall of Fame jockey later, his name was Mac Garner. He lived down in Covington, and he was the jockey on this horse. And of course, Zeb was ridden by the classic and Hall of Fame jockey Earl Sandy. And so the race was held, and unbelievably, In Memoriam won. But this was just the type of stuff that promoters needed, because in 1919, Matt Wynn had bought, along with a consortium, had bought all the tracks in Kentucky, including Latonia. And he saw this as an opportunity to promote something. So he scheduled a match race between Zev and In Memoriam at Churchill Downs. And that race was run, one of the most controversial races ever run, because they had no photos to take the winner's picture. And they declared Zev the winner, and most people said Zev did not win that race, but it was better suited for Matt Wynn's purpose. Incidentally, I bought that program about a month ago. So
Really?
yeah, and it's one of the two famous races held at Churchill Downs. An earlier one between Molly and Tenbrook in 1878 is one of the most famous match races. Things were great for Old Latonia right through the 20s. The last Derby horse, many Derby horses ran at Old Latonia, but the last one to run there was a horse by the name of Clyde Van Dusen. He had won the 1929 Derby. He did not win his race at Latonia, but that was almost the moment where the change began to take place, because as you well know, there was something called a depression that was about to take place. And once that depression hit, Old Latonia had to struggle to survive. They did everything they could think of. They gave free admissions. They had late ride racing. They had clip coupons that you could turn in. They had pooling of all sorts of things, but it was a decline, and the quality of the races dropped significantly from 29 until finally in 1939, without any warning whatsoever, the Old Latonia shut down. And you can still see vestiges of some of the things. A couple of barns still are down there. And one of the things that made it so interesting was it had tremendous rail service, and the horses would be shipped into Old Latonia and then shipped back out to race everywhere. And there were very famous jockeys that were down there, including a fellow by the name of Eddie Arcaro, who worked horses down there and illegally raced a couple of times. Went down to Tijuana and won his first race. But the change there left us without any track in northern Kentucky. And then in 1959, early 59, a group of horsemen met at the Old White Horse, which was on the Dixie Highway. Ben Castleman, who was a horseman, owned the White Horse, and a fellow by the name of Matt Wynn Williamson, who was the grandson of the famous Matt Wynn, the man who made the Kentucky Derby famous. Matt Wynn Williamson put a group of investors together, and they decided to build a new track, which they would call Latonia. So you have the Old Latonia, and then in 59 they would open up as New Latonia. They didn't call it New Latonia, they just called it Latonia.
Mm-hmm.
I actually helped put dirt down on that track because my father was involved with some of those people, and I had a job, and the Carlisle Construction Company worked on it, and there were a lot of interesting things that happened there, but we don't have the time to talk about that. But Latonia opened up as kind of a leaky roof type track, small time racing. But they got as their general manager a fellow by the name of John Battaglia, whose son, Mike Battaglia, became a famous linesman, making the line, and race commentator, calling the Derby later too. He still makes the line for Churchill Downs and sometimes Keeneland. And so John Battaglia had this dream, and the dream was to get a race that would spiral up and prepare horses for the Kentucky Derby. And they began to run something called the Spiral Stakes. And it eventually evolved into what is known as the Beam Stakes. It's gone through many names and so on. But in 1986, a very successful man from Aurora, Indiana, who had made a fortune in Nashville speculating in land and properties, came up and bought Latonia. And he renamed it Turfway. His name is Jerry Carroll, of course. And Carroll took Turfway to another level. He began to set up off-track betting. He had many innovations. He made the beefsteaks raise in purse, and at one time the beefsteaks was the largest price purse in the United States. It kind of forced the Derby and the Preakness and the Belmonts to raise their purses to stay in competition. And he would bring, we'd have a festival here, a week-long festival, along with the actual race itself, and Carroll would bring in celebrities like Milton Berle and Red Skelton and many, many others. And so it was a happening. It was in every sense of the word a happening. It wasn't perfect. One time, one of the race days, the electricity went out and they had to cancel it and run it the next day. But ultimately, Carroll would be bought out, and there would be a combination of owners, including Keeneland. Keeneland had a percentage of it. But in October, October of 2019, Churchill Downs bought Turfway, and the game changed. Churchill Downs is a multi-million-dollar mega corporation with tracks all over the place, and they committed to tearing down the old track, which was a wreck, to be perfectly honest about it, and building a new facility. And they have begun construction on that facility, and probably will open about July of the coming year. And they're only putting $150 million in this project.
I really appreciate you coming and sharing this with us and showing me this.
Yeah, of course, this is the book I wrote out, Old Latonia.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
so
it came out in '97. It needs to be updated, but it outlines pretty much. And here is a program. The cover is actually a program from 1887 of Old Latonia, which is quite a collector's item in itself. So I use that as the cover of the book.
I think I've shown you. I believe we have one from about '89.
Yeah.
That's in our collection. That's a fascinating one, and there's a couple of other artifacts that we have here. A series of photographs around 1919 that's been part of this museum collection for a very long time, probably back 70 years that we've had this here. And I love coming across things in our collection that I look at and I go, well, Dr. Claypool will be able to tell me about this. So I love having these conversations with you because you're a wealth of knowledge, and I really appreciate your willingness to share this with me. And I've learned so much today, and I hope everybody that's watching has learned so much and's got excited about a little bit of Kentucky heritage and horse racing. And hope we all have luck at the upcoming Derby, and we enjoy it tremendously. And make sure you got a good hat.
Well, let me give you some advice about the Derby.
All right.
This will guarantee that you will win the Kentucky Derby, and everybody wants to know how to do that. And the way you do that is you never bet slow horses.
Well, that would never bet a slow horse, and I'll have to remember that's where I've been going wrong. Is evidently I bet the slow horses. Thank you so much, and thank you everybody for watching this Curator's Chat, and we'll see you in our next Curator's Chat, and we'll see you in the future.